Richmond, Monday, June 2nd, 1862. My dear Winnie, on Saturday we had a severe battle and suffered severely in attacking the enemy's entrenchments. General J.E. Johnston is severely wounded. The poor fellow bore his suffering most heroically. General Lee is in the field commanding. Jefferson Davis.
Robert E. Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia on June 1, 1862, after the Battle of Seven Pines, and the rest is history. The day that Lee took command was the day that Joseph E. Johnston lost command of the Confederacy's most prominent army. It was the most important of the many intersections in the parallel lives and careers of Joseph Johnston and Robert Lee. The relationship between Johnston and Lee began before they were born. Johnston's father, Peter, was a private in the Continental Army during the Revolution and served under Lee's father, Colonel, later General, Henry Lee. Johnston and Lee met as students in the West Point class of 1829. Johnston graduated 13th in the class, Lee 2nd. They both served with distinction in the Mexican War and, after 30 years of active service, finally won long-sought promotions in the U.S. Army, just before following Virginia, their native state, out of the Union and into the Confederacy in 1861. Lee spent much of the Civil War's first year in Richmond as a military advisor to President Davis, and also in military commands that tarnished slightly his sterling pre-war reputation. Meanwhile, Johnston won glory for himself and for the Confederacy as commander of the victorious army at Manassas, or Bull Run, on July 21, 1861. In the months after Manassas, Johnston undermined his own status by engaging in a war of words with President Davis. Johnston insisted that his U.S. Army rank entitled him to seniority in the Confederate Army. He was ranked 4th, Robert Lee 3rd. In the spring of 1862, the Confederacy prepared to confront the largest force ever assembled on the continent, General George B. McClellan's Union Army of the Potomac, moving against Richmond.
McClellan planned to attack Richmond from Virginia's peninsula, and there was a discussion and debate here in the Confederate High Command what to do about that. And Joe Johnston favored making Richmond the line of defense. He would save Richmond from just outside its gates. And Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee seemed to favor something a little bit further down the peninsula, say Yorktown or Williamsburg, making a stand there against McClellan, and ideally he would never get to Richmond. Here, in the state dining room of the White House of the Confederacy, this grand strategy meeting continued into the wee small hours of the morning of April the 15th, 1862. And the debate became very heated, particularly between the old classmates.
Lee won the argument in the short run, but Johnston's army soon had to fall back before McClellan's huge force. In late May, the Union Army was within 10 miles of the Confederate capital.
Johnston ultimately planned to meet McClellan on ground of his choosing, just outside of Richmond, at a little crossroads at Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. And he set his trap there, but unfortunately for him, things did not go according to plan. During the fighting on May 31st, late in the afternoon, Joe Johnston was wounded rather seriously. First, he was hit with a spent round of ammunition, and then he took a shell fragment to the chest. He was taken off the field while still conscious, and eventually realized that he no longer had with him his favorite sidearms.
That sword was the one worn by my father in the Revolutionary War, and I would not lose it for $10,000. Will not someone please go back and get it and the pistols for me?
This sword, carried by Joseph E. Johnston, was originally carried by his father, Peter Johnston, during the American Revolution. Also on display here in the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond is his Colt pistol. Both items were donated to the museum in 1915 by his nephew.
Johnston recovered from his wounds in Richmond. Meanwhile, Davis placed Robert Lee in temporary command of Johnston's army. Lee made the most of his opportunity and used the army to drive McClellan away from Richmond and fight a series of campaigns and battles that won international fame for himself and the army. After losing his command, Joseph Johnston did not fade into obscurity. When Johnston recovered late in 1862, Davis gave him a command in the Western Theater. Over the next several years, Johnston was the Confederacy's primary commander in the West, winning the affection of the soldiers of the Army of Tennessee. In April 1865, when U.S. Grant's campaign compelled Lee to evacuate Petersburg and Richmond, Lee's last best hope for survival was to link up on the Virginia-North Carolina border with the army of Joseph E. Johnston. Lee never made it there, surrendering instead at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. Lee's surrender left Johnston little choice but to negotiate for the surrender of his own army 3 weeks later. The two men met only once after the war, in Savannah in April 1870. The old warriors posed for this photograph. Lee died several months after the photo was taken. Copies of this photo were sold to raise money for the monument to Lee in Richmond. Johnston lived another 20 years, long enough to bury old comrades and enemies. In May 1890, Johnston was given the honor of pulling the rope to unveil the heroic bronze statue of Lee in Richmond on what later became Monument Avenue.